It is May 1945. The smoke is finally clearing over the ruins of Berlin. The German war machine has been crushed. Adolf Hitler is dead, and the most devastating conflict in human history has come to a close. In London, New York, and Paris, millions of people are flooding the streets. There is dancing, singing, and an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare is over. Or at least, that is what the world believed. But while the champagne corks were popping and soldiers were dreaming of going home, one man was sitting in a fortified bunker in London, consumed by a dark and terrifying thought. That man was Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was not celebrating. Instead, he was staring at a map of Europe that looked drastically different from the one he had fought to save. To the public, the Soviet Union was a heroic ally that had helped defeat the Nazis. But to Churchill, Josef Stalin was a predator waiting in the shadows. While the world slept peacefully for the first time in 6 years, Churchill made a secret phone call to his top military planners. His order was chillingly simple: prepare for war against Russia. He didn't mean a diplomatic standoff. He meant a full-scale invasion. This top-secret plan was given the code name Operation Unthinkable, and had it been launched, the celebrations of 1945 would have been cut short by the sound of nuclear blasts and a third, even deadlier world war. To understand why Churchill was willing to turn on his own ally so quickly, we must look at the tragic reality of Eastern Europe. Britain had entered World War II in 1939 for one specific reason: to defend the independence of Poland from German aggression. Yet, in 1945, as the Nazis retreated, the Polish people were not free. They had simply exchanged one occupier for another. The Soviet Red Army had rolled across Poland, not as liberators, but as conquerors. Stalin was arresting Polish resistance leaders, installing a puppet communist government, and erasing any hope of democracy. Churchill felt a deep, personal sense of guilt. He realized that the Allies had defeated fascism only to allow totalitarianism to take its place. He famously remarked that an iron curtain is descending across the continent. The tension came to a breaking point at the Yalta Conference. Churchill saw the look in Stalin's eyes, the hunger for control. He realized that the Soviet Union had no intention of returning to its borders. With the Americans preparing to withdraw their troops from Europe to fight Japan in the Pacific, Churchill feared that nothing stood between the Red Army and the Atlantic Ocean. In his mind, if he didn't act now, all of Europe would fall to communism within months. So, the British War Cabinet went to work. The goal of Operation Unthinkable was to impose the will of the Western Allies on Russia by force. The target date for the invasion was set for July 1st, 1945, less than 2 months after the German surrender. The plan called for a massive surprise attack in northern Germany. The strategy relied on 47 British and American divisions smashing through the Soviet lines in a blitzkrieg-style assault. They planned to push the Soviets back to Poland and force Stalin to negotiate. But as the British generals, hardened by years of war, began to calculate the logistics, the plan began to look like a suicide mission. The odds were staggeringly against them. For every 1 American or British tank, the Soviets had 3. The Red Army had over 11 million men in the field. Their T-34 tanks were technically superior to almost everything the Allies possessed, and their soldiers were riding a wave of victory, having just destroyed the best armies Germany had to offer. The British planners realized they simply ran out of men. They needed more bodies to throw into the meat grinder. This desperation led to the most shocking part of the entire operation, a detail that remained classified for decades because it was too controversial to reveal. The British military concluded that the only way to match the sheer size of the Russian army was to use the enemy they had just defeated. The plan proposed keeping the captured German Wehrmacht units intact. Instead of sending these German soldiers to prison camps, the British would rearm them. Imagine the scene: 100,000 Nazi soldiers, given their rifles back, answering to British officers, and marching east to fight the Russians. It was a moral abomination. Just weeks prior, these men were the sworn enemy of the free world. Now, Churchill was considering using them as pawns in a new game. This suggestion highlights just how terrified the British command was of the Soviet threat. They were willing to make a deal with the devil to stop Stalin. However, even with the help of rearmed German divisions, the math didn't add up. The Red Army controlled the logistics of Europe. They had shorter supply lines and an air force that had grown massive during the war. The British planners noted that if the initial surprise attack failed to break the Soviet spirit, the Allies would find themselves in a total war. This wouldn't be a quick skirmish. It would be a grinding conflict deep into the Russian winter, the exact same mistake Napoleon and Hitler had made. Ultimately, a war is not fought on maps. It is fought with political will. And that is where Operation Unthinkable truly died. Churchill needed the United States. Without the immense industrial power and manpower of America, Britain stood no chance. But across the ocean, President Harry Truman had zero interest in fighting Russia. The American public was tired. They were still engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan in the Pacific. The idea of telling an American mother that her son, who survived the beaches of Normandy, now had to go die in the snow of Poland was politically impossible. When the British generals presented the final report to Churchill on June 8th, their conclusion was blunt. It is more than probable that Russia will win. They even drafted a defensive plan outlining what to do when the Soviets counterattacked. It predicted that the Red Army would crush the Allied forces in Europe and push them all the way back to the English Channel. It would have been Dunkirk all over again, but on a much larger scale. Faced with the reality that he would be fighting alone and destined to lose, Churchill reluctantly shelved the plan. The file was marked top secret and buried deep in the archives. July 1st, 1945, came and went without a shot being fired. Instead of World War III, the world entered the Cold War, a silent, terrifying standoff that lasted for 45 years. But we must ask the question, was Churchill right? He enslaved Eastern Europe, crushed uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and built a nuclear arsenal that threatened human existence. Churchill lost the general election shortly after the war ended, dismissed by a British public that wanted peace, not more conflict. But history has a way of vindicating paranoia. Operation Unthinkable remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of the 20th century. It shows us how fragile peace really is. We assume that history follows a straight line, but in 1945, the fate of the world hung on the decision of one man staring at a map in a smoky room, deciding whether or not to unleash hell on Earth once again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secret history of World War III, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. What do you think should the Allies have attacked Russia in 1945? Let me know in the comments below.